Hi, everybody. It's 5 p.m. I'm Tina Brock. I am your host for Into the Absurd, of virtually existential dinner conversation. And we're so glad you have joined us today. If you are coming in on Zoom, welcome, welcome. We would love to have your questions to come into the chat box throughout our 50-minute conversation with Joanna Rotté, who will get to the dinner table in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to tap dance a little bit here as the folks who work with the IRC, Erica Holscher, Associate Artistic Director, Bob Schmidt, who handles everything stage related, not stage related. We call him the Ways and Means Coordinator, and he does a whole lot of work around here. So they are helping to get everybody in the room today. They will be shepherding your questions, and they'll be our technical assistants, and they're so great every week. So I want to send a huge shout out to them and to everybody who's joined us. And you can always find past episodes of Into the Absurd over on the IRC's YouTube channel at Idiopathic Ridiculopathy Consortium. And when you're over there, please subscribe. We are trying to spread the word. This is our opportunity every week to come to you with existential questions and passions of people in the community. Today's show, Joanna Rotté, and I'm super excited to talk to her. She is Professor Emeritus at Villanova University, and she's written a couple of books that we're going to talk about today. One of them called Acting with Adler, which is her chronicling of her time with Stella Adler at the Stella Adler Conservatory, and also Scene Change, which chronicles her work and her journeys studying theater in Berlin and Leningrad and Moscow. And a lot more is coming. So let us get Joanna Rotté to the table and begin this beautiful conversation, which will include Beckett as well, I hope. That's which I'm waiting for. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you, Tina.
I am, I think we met many years ago when we shared a love. I think you had come to an IRC show and found out we shared a love of existentialist theater and Beckett, and have talked a couple of times, and I'm just feel so honored to have you here today. And I think I would love to start with your time at the Stella Adler Conservatory and your meeting. You met Harold Clurman first, correct? He was a professor when you were studying at CUNY, was that right?
Yes. So let me say, yes, we did meet at the IRC some years ago, probably when you first started. And I was so grateful for your mission and what you accomplished in bringing those playwrights who are so important to me to Philadelphia, and continue to do that. And hopefully we'll bring it live again someday. So thanks for that, Tina. Yeah, it's good to start with Stella because I actually studied the absurdist with Stella in my 4th semester with her, because she saw a direct link from her most favorite playwright and who she considered the most important playwright in terms of bringing us into the 20th century or modern acting, and that was Chekhov. And she, when she taught the absurdists in script analysis, she took a direct line from Chekhov, particularly Cherry Orchard, to Beckett, and that he was the inheritor of Chekhov. So, yeah, well, I met Stella through Harold Clurman, who was my professor in the graduate program, City University of New York Graduate Center. He was teaching a course called Theater Between the Wars. And that was theater, American theater between the First and Second War, which was really the birth of American theater, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Starting with O'Neill, who was our first real American playwright who dealt with the existential nature of what is it to be an American. So that was how I met Harold, who by that time had the moniker of father of the American theater. He had started, along with Lee Strasberg, the group theater in the 30s, of which Stella was a member, and probably to this day is the single most important, sustained for 10 years group of actors that stayed together because of how they influenced American acting and changed it entirely. Mm-hmm. So he was my teacher, and I think it was after the first class, we were having, no, it was during the first class, we were having a break in the hallway, And he said to me, "Do you think you'd like to go to the theater with me sometime?" And I said, "I thought I might like that." So that became the beginning of a friendship between Harold and me, which lasted until his death in 1980. But I went to many, many, many opening nights with him. He was then the theater critic for The Nation, and was the most wonderful companion to go to the theater with. So I really learned from being quiet and sitting next to him and watching. And one thing that was so important to me that he said was, "I don't know what I think about a piece until I start writing about it." And that was kind of in response to audience members who would often come up to him at intermission and say, "What do you think, Harold? What do you think?" And he would never answer other than, "We'll see."
When I start writing.
When I start writing, tomorrow morning or Monday morning, because he was fortunate. He always said he was fortunate he didn't write for a daily, meaning you didn't have to write every day or the next day to get it in, because he could think about it.
Yeah.
And then he wrote a column a week.
I love the story in your book where you talked about being at dinner either before or after the performance, and Stella Adler's at an adjoining table or another table in the restaurant. And was that the time in which she said to you, "You have to choose between him and me"? Something to that.
She said that a little later. She said that a little later after I became her student. That was meeting her for the first time.
Oh.
And Harold introduced me as a doctoral candidate in the PhD program at the great City University of New York Graduate Center. And she looked at me and looked at him and looked at me and then said, "Yes, but what does she know?"
Yes.
And I thought, maybe she has something to teach me. So it was after that I asked Harold, when I decided that I really didn't know what a technique of acting was, even though I had had acting teachers in undergraduate school and in a graduate program at the University of Colorado, a master's program. I really felt that there was not a sustainable system, a path for an actor to go step by step through training the entire instrument, as Stella would say. She would say, "Bring me material. You have to bring material that I can work with." So this training of the whole being is what she established in America. And I had not had that. So I asked Harold, who should I study with? And I think he didn't want to push me towards Stella particularly. She was, after all, his former wife and his leading lady for 10 years in the group theater. But so he said, "Well, you might want to study with Stella, or you might want to study with Uta Hagen." And I ended up studying with Stella.
She talks, or you talk in the book about dividing or creating artistic, spiritual, and physical, sort of three areas that you talk about the training focusing on. When you went into it, is there an area for you that stands out as the place where you grew the most or learned the most of those three?
Yeah, I think that even though I had been to college, I think the revelation for me was the embodiment that the actor does of the text. And what Stella brought she brought many things, but something that to her dying day that still other acting teachers weren't doing, is she taught this script analysis from the point of view of the actor. So we studied plays, but not in any way like you would study it in an English department class or even a theater drama class. But we studied them of what do you do now in this moment? Mm-hmm. Here are the given circumstances. So what is it to live in these given circumstances as opposed to those given circumstances, these specific given circumstances? And what would you do if you yourself were living there? And then drop that, and what would the character do in these given circumstances? And that required a different embodiment to do it from the point of view of the character. That came later in the training. She started with just for a year working on the actor becoming, as she would say, get very familiar with that stage. Get very cozy with that stage, get at home on that stage, so that it is a place where the fear and the anxiety can calm down. Mm-hmm. And it can be a place where other things open up.
You talk a little bit about, I think the phrasing is that when you would go to perform for Stella, the anxiety really never went away. It was always kind of there for you. Do I have that right? Did I quote that right? And I think it was speaking in the larger context of just it was in the beginning of the book and talking about how when you started, you had, of your 2-year period, you had 40 people in the class. And by the time you ended, there were 7, and then talked about how formidable she was, what a formidable presence she was. And I guess I'm wondering, I may be conflating two parts of the book there, the anxiety part of it, but I'm interested in that formidable part, what it was.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. You go ahead.
Yeah, I think there was always some what we would call stage fright before anybody went up to do work. And the work could be work without words. It didn't matter. It could be sewing on stage with a partner and having a specific objective or intention or specific action. Or it could be doing scene work, which didn't happen until the 2nd year of training. So it was 2 years of training with her for me. And then a year of performing our 7 people with a few more added in. So yes, there were 40 of us. Well, why did people drop out? Part of it was the formidable nature of Stella. She taught from like a throne-like chair.
Didn't you say she had like a throne, right?
Yeah, but it was very fitting. That throne still exists. And Stella's grandson runs the conservatory in New York City now. And I taught there around the time of 9/11. I was teaching there a script analysis class. But I have been back, and I'm friends with Tom Oppenheim, is his name, Stella's grandson. But that chair exists. It's still there. And one could sit in it. So there was that sense of, she was so huge. She was, as Harold would say, larger than life, no question. She was a very theatrical person. And just entering the room was an entrance for Stella. But
okay.
If you want the story of where we all were terrified of her, that's the Backstage story.
Yeah, that's a great one. Let's talk about that one.
So this was after we 7 had completed our coursework, and we were working on plays, and she got directors for us. We were doing short pieces, and she condescended to direct us. It wouldn't be her turn, it's my turn. She allowed herself to give us the time of her being with us as a director, and that was in Thornton Wilder's Happy Journey. Yeah. I was playing the mother in that play. My friend, who's my friend to this day, Dan Merchant, played my husband, Pa. I was Ma, and we were Pa. We were in our early 20s playing these roles.
Don't
but
this.
we totally believed it, of course. And anyway, we had an audience coming, and variety and reviews and all this. So here it was, and I guess we were in dress rehearsal, and there was we were performing at the studio, and there was a little tiny backstage space. So boys and girls, we were mixed in together. There were probably 6 of us in that play, and putting on our makeup, and we all smoked then, and we had coffee. And she came back to check on us before curtain, and she saw that the place was a mess, and the cigarette butts, and she didn't say anything, and we got a little bit scared because the look she gave, and she came back with a bucket and suds and a rag, and she got down on her hands and knees, and she was in her 70s, and she started scrubbing things, and it was terrifying because it was not, the queen is not supposed to be on her hands and knees. But of course it was a lesson beyond any that she could ever say with words, that she conveyed to us, of the respect that the actor must command in this world for their work, and it begins with how you take care of your space. So surely that affected us lifelong. By the way, that group, the Happy Journey group, we came together, which Dan and I brought about, all of us, Dan, Pa, and our 2 children, who rode in the back seat of our car. And the journey is the journey to see the married daughter in Trenton. So it's from Camden to Trenton.
It's called the Happy Journey from Camden to Trenton, right?
Yes.
Or Trenton to Camden.
One or the other.
Yeah, right.
And
oh no.
So we 4, 5, and there may be a stage manager in that play as well. But we got, like in our town, we got together in probably around early 2000s. We all met, somebody living in New England, somebody living on the West Coast, somebody living in the South, Dan in New York, I was in Philadelphia at the time. And we met at the Stella Adler studio, the conservatory, and a friend of mine, a former student from Villanova, Jill, was there, and she filmed us, and we read the play. We took our parts and we redid it. And yeah, so that, the kind of bonds, well, first we went to see Awake and Sing. The Mark Ruffalo was in the revival, which of course Stella had premiered as Bessie Berger, and Harold Clurman had directed. So that was to give you a sense of the legacy that she was providing for us, and how 30 years later, we still hadn't seen each other in 30 years without thinking much, came together at that studio and read that play.
So you formed as a company when you were studying together during your 2 years, the 7 of you that remained. Did you form a company, and you did a number of productions?
We did.
Didn't you?
Yeah, we formed a company sort of when we finished our training, because it was like, well, what do we do now? And of course, that time in the business, what you did is you got headshots, and you got a resume pasted on the back of your headshots, and you went knocking on doors. You went to agents over and over and over, and you tried to get auditions, and eventually you tried to get into Actors Equity. And that was the life that lay ahead. And that's another reason why I think people stopped studying with Stella or left her from my class, is just the nature. She wasn't teaching us to be ready for the business. She wasn't teaching us how to do resumes, and she didn't have a great deal of regard for that whole system. And there were people definitely who said that's what they wanted. They wanted TV, they wanted the movies, they wanted Broadway, they wanted an agent, they wanted to get in the business, and they wanted to get out of here in this training. So the people who stayed were people who really wanted the theater.
During that time, did you have exposure, was there in the sort of spiritual component of that, of the three tiered that you talk about in the book, how did that get brought into the teaching? Was it really, was it specific to sort of Eastern philosophy? Was it just internal, looking inside of oneself? You talk a little bit about that in the book, just what she expected of you to sort of be in there, really taking stock of your life and where, and really taking, doing an inventory of where you needed to be. Is that how it manifested spiritually? I guess I'm thinking down the road of when did the sort of your interest in the Eastern philosophy play in?
Yes, you said it beautifully, Tina. That's exactly what the spiritual component of the training is taking stock of your life, learning to know in whatever way you can the nature of your own mind and how you can ride this as the instrument for creativity. Also, you may know there was a lifelong disparity between Strasberg and Adler. And that was about the approach that the actor takes, whether it is what Stella would say, wringing the emotion from me and my life and recalling my grandmother who died when I'm in the scene, or is it that I am in the circumstances of the character and I use imagination, and the instruments that I have convey my imaginative understanding to turn it into an experience of living here in these foreign circumstances in this moment and bring this moment alive. So she thought that Strasberg did a great disservice to the actor by, in a sense, not working through imagination, but working through their own feelings and their own life, and the whole thing of, memory recall and effective memory of one's own circumstances rather than the circumstances of the play. Recently, with the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I was talking on the phone to my friend Dan, who was Pa, and we still, whenever we talk, we say Ma and Pa. So I was like, I said, what would Stella think? The coronavirus, the COVID. And he said, Stella would say, we survived Lee Strasberg. We'll survive this.
COVID. The formidable foe.
Yeah.
It is. And would you say that what you just described about her feeling about this sort of presence in the moment, the being there right now with the circumstances, is where she primarily, I don't know, went a different direction than Stanislavski? I mean, that because she studied with Stanislavski, correct? And
yes.
Early on. So was part of, I thought I read this in the book, that part of what she was trying to do was take that as a great foundation, but also to bring about these, the way of being very present and very in the room with what was happening right then, and not to be locked up in the imagination or sense memory or going to transported to some other place. Is that basically where the two trainings
She would
are a
say
little
that
different?
she didn't add anything. In fact, she said that to me once, which I think that she did a kind of American Stanislavski system. And by that, I would say, if you look at Brando, I would say that she brought muscle to it.
Mhm.
And there's, and the, I once met Arthur Miller through Harold Clurman, and I don't remember if that was this meeting or another time, but he said, and this was over dinner, so there was time to talk with him, but he was there in the audience on the opening night of Streetcar Named Desire, with Brando playing Stanley Kowalski. And Brando, of course, had studied with Stella by this time. And in fact, Stella recommended him to Kazan for the role. So Arthur Miller said, when Brando took off his shirt, this had never happened before in the American theater. There had never been that sense of male sexuality in that way. If you think about the movies from the 30s and the 40s, men were gentlemen. They would be courtly or rakish, but that raw sensuality that Brando had. So I wasn't there, but Arthur Miller, who I would think is a reliable witness, said that in the audience, when he took off his shirt, women fainted. I think that's what I mean by an Americanization of the system, that it became even more on the outside. Whatever is going on the inside was brought out more so. But she also felt that Americans could understand Stanislavski because the Russians are so passionate, and somehow we can do that too. But maybe we do it more through the body. So
no.
Perhaps that's what was her contribution.
The idea of, I'm just thinking of being fully present on stage and what's required in the work of Beckett, and to be in that space of sharing where nothing happens and no one comes, and it is just this existential place, requires this full investment in cellularly, in the work. What brought you, how did you find Beckett to begin with? Was it through Stella?
It was. I don't know if I'd been introduced to Beckett in graduate school, but I certainly took Beckett from Stella, through Stella, took to him. And what brought me to, why did I direct 2 Beckett plays? Well, I think, can you say that? Why do you, there's something so pertinent for getting to the very fundamental question of what it is to be alive, embodied as a human being in relationship. And later in the work, he takes people out of relationship and puts them into relationship with an audience that they don't see or hear. But the plays that I did, waiting for, first Endgame and then Waiting for Godot, they are in relationship. So where they are, the Godot, I looked it up because I thought, what is that stage direction? Country road, a tree. Okay. And endgame, I think it says, what does it say? Not a room, but something like a cavern, something.
I mean, it's very specific about the windows and where they're, you know, where they're placed in the space. And
yeah, I mean, I taught at Villanova. My primary courses in the graduate program were script analysis from the point of view of the theater performer and director, and voice and movement. And so that was very much the embodiment of discovering character through that class that I taught. So I liked that challenge in Beckett, that, yeah, you have to find, in a sense, a new body, the actor. And there are great actors who have done Beckett and said it's the hardest work they ever did. And you wouldn't know that by reading the play. But as we know, as you know, Tina, Beckett's estate continues to demand that no one vary, no variation from what he set out. You don't cut, you don't drop lines, you don't do it differently. And it's not precious, that demand, I think. It has a sanity to it that he has created the puzzle, and every piece is needed. And it's our job to solve the puzzle of the play. So for example, in Endgame, I knew by that time that Beckett was, of course, a chess player. I knew that, and I knew that one of his best friends, or his best friend in Paris, was Giacometti, right? And Giacometti was like him, long and lean. And we have those Giacometti sculptures, which are long and lean. And they walked at night through Paris, just the two of them. And one imagines they didn't talk, they just walked. And maybe once in a while they said something, who knows, but for hours. So just walking.
Similar with Joyce, right? They would sit when he was his, working with Joyce, they would just sit for hours and really not say anything to each other and just communicate in this sort of existential land of Godot, or, that sort of, they understood each other so well, is the way I understood it. They didn't really have to speak.
Or that the futility of meaningless chatter, like Winnie.
Yeah, true.
Or the futility, I don't want to say meaningless chatter, but of trying to say what one's heart, and the futility of expressing that to another's. Whereas silence maybe is fuller. So I would call it contemplative time, or meditative time, that Giacometti and Beckett had.
Do you think that that's what makes Beckett frightening for some people, directors and actors alike? That it forces you really, or it demands of you much of what Stella was asking you all to do in her class, and that was to really take an inventory, people, and that's a different state of being than what's required.
Great, thank you. I've called Beckett myself kind of an accidental Buddhist, in the sense that he understands that existence is filled with forms of suffering. And we are in a situation where we're trying to minimize our suffering. And I think that's what we see throughout Godot, is the anguish and the angst. And for any human being to be willing to enter into that space authentically is asking a lot of the actor. So we know that Beckett has done so well in prison work with people who understand this, that all their distractions are stripped away, and they either have to invent new distractions or they come to terms with what it is to be in silence or in confinement. Not silence because it's not quiet in prisons, but their own silence. But anyway, I want to say one thing about the end game, and then we can come back to this, your wonderful question of how difficult it is for actors, or how challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. We will both admit, I know. That is, when I did the end game, this was a program, and that's like a chessboard. Mm-hmm. So that was I think that was the stage floor. But the man, Steve Smith, wonderful actor playing Clove. First of all, Steve is about maybe 5'8" and 5'7" in bare feet, and rather slight. He wore, I think, 12-inch high, not boots, like those 70s shoes.
Mm-hmm. Almost a platform in the photos, which are on your website, I think, but we'll also make sure that we put the links in there so everybody can take a look.
So he was this unbelievably long, lean Beckettian, Giacometti sculpture on stage. Yeah. The second thing that I wanted us to do is that he moved as if on the chessboard. Of course, Ham, his counterpart, never moves. He's in the throne. He's sitting in his throne, and he does not get up or down. So Clove, who was his kind of servant, does everything for him. But he only moved the way a knight moves on the chessboard. So in square, angular moves. Mm-hmm. Couldn't do any circular moves. I wish, that's all I wanted to say. It was, for me, a kind of homage to Beckett that seemed very important at the time. I was so in love with Beckett. I remember one night in rehearsal just falling to my knees and saying, this is such a privilege to be in the presence of a masterpiece.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something fundamental that happens. Both Bob Schmidt, who's working the technical, that we met early at the IRC, we both worked on a production, not for the IRC, but for another company a number of years ago. Bob played Clove, and I was in the trash can. And there's something that happens every night that is transformative. Mm. Hopefully for the audience, for the actor. Let me ask you, in your production at Villanova, did you all have traps for the trash cans, or were they able, or did they have to get in? Did Nag and Nell have to get in the cans every night?
So in other words, were they there before the audience came?
Yeah, like in our production, which was a pretty bare bones production, we had to get in the trash can and hang out,
I think they had to get in there because the trash cans were downstage. Villanova at that time was a 3/4, and they were down off audience left, slightly mm-hmm. off center, mm-hmm.
Right.
Left.
Yep.
And the traps that we have in that theater were more center and upstage. I don't think there were traps No, I think they must have gotten in there before. Dear God.
I'll tell this really very quick story about being in the trash can, having a little book light and a you know, a little book and a very close to being empty cup of coffee one night
Oh.
that accidentally spilled over, to which it like leaked out underneath the trash can and looked like it was after we had both been taken care of, been offed. And so it looked as though we were then decomposing, but I didn't know that it happened. And people in the front row were talking about it. She's decomposing. I think that memory, not the coffee, but being in the trash can, the confinement of that, having the lid on, just and that was so typical of Beckett, right? To put the actor in such a position, whether it's, you know, rockabye or any of the positions between the text and the body, it really, it can't help but transform you on some level, you know, your spirit, I think. So would you say your interest in Eastern philosophy was something that grew stronger with Beckett? Did one come before the other? Did they nurture each other along the way, I'm assuming?
They did. And I, for no understandable reason, became interested in Japan when I was in high school. And I did not come from a family where that particularly would have happened. My father hadn't been in the Second World War, but he was in essential industries. But he had friends who went to the war and were injured, and in Japan as well, or in I guess the Philippines. So he didn't have a good feeling for Japan, but I did. And early on in my life, I was very drawn to Japanese literature, eventually Japanese theater, and certainly Japanese thought, particularly through Zen. And so by the time I got to Beckett or got to doing Beckett, I was pretty much in that world, though maybe that was the beginning of kind of bringing those two streams together or closer together, because after that I did much more work that was closer to kind of Eastern thought. Yeah. There's a story, you might like this story, Tina, and the audience. The guests, the dinner guests. I hope people are enjoying their dinner, their wine. I have some water.
I have my water here too. And I'm in Japan, so we can.
Yeah.
We'll take that walk someday. I would love that.
Little sake. Yeah, so in 2000, in the Philadelphia Fringe Festival, I was doing a play called Prajna, which I had done an adaptation of. It was a play that was written by a Tibetan Buddhist meditation master named Chogyam Trungpa, who escaped from Tibet at the time of the Chinese invasion by walking out of Tibet over the Himalayas. In any case, he became a great teacher in America, and he wrote a few plays. This was a kind of fun little folk play, but it had a contemplative component to it. And it was staged in a theater at the Philadelphia Fringe Festival. I had actors and seasoned meditators both in the cast. And at one point, everything stopped because the action of the play had flipped, and I had everyone sit in half lotus on stage and just stop. And they did it for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. There was utter quietude. And one thing I wanted to see is what the audience would do. Was it possible to do this in the theater? And 4 minutes and 33 seconds, because that's the name of a famous piece by John Cage, which you may know, in which the actors, the musicians come on stage, they take out their instruments, and for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, they do not play. So the composition becomes the sound in the environment. And after 4 minutes and 33 seconds, they pack up and leave. So in tribute to John Cage, we did 4 minutes and 33 seconds of sitting in meditation posture on stage. Well, I sat out in the lobby and people came out after, and comments were like, I love the part where we all meditated together. I was stunned at how the audience entered into this. And there was not shuffling. It really did become an entire theater that entered into a Beckettian kind of stillness, of silence, as we would imagine, as you talked about Joyce and Beckett sitting there. So the story about that last performance we did was a Monday night in September, and we had the 10 p.m. slot, and we came down at 11. And I will swear to this day that that was the last production that year of the Philadelphia Fringe Festival, because the next day it was all canceled, because the next day was September 11th, 2001. And there's some part of me that wants to think that the plane that did not make it to crash into Washington, D.C., but that the people on the plane took it down over Pennsylvania that next day. And the play we did was called Prajna, which means wisdom, that somehow they live in the same universe. That's the year also that I directed Waiting for Godot. So from that, we went from Prajna to 9/11, to the terror and the horror and that our country lived through. And then in probably November, we were rehearsing Godot. And I remember the conversations that the actors and the unsettledness, if we remember back to the beginning of COVID, how unsettled, not that we're out of it, but I think we've settled in a little bit to this reality.
To the existential.
Yeah, this existential reality.
I'm thinking back on the Prajna.
Yes.
And the invitation to just be in the room for that span of time. How did the audience get restless before they got calm? Were you able to ever sort of follow the flow of what that did? I'd just be interested to know, like, and did the word get out that this is what's going to happen? There's a 5-minute meditation pause in the show. I think that point at which people don't know what to do is so very interesting.
Yes.
In an audience performer relationship.
Tina, I wish I could answer that, and I can't, because I was never in the house.
Right.
I wasn't, because it was a small theater. It was like a 55 seat house or something. And it was, the Philadelphia Inquirer wrote about it before we opened in the religion column, of all things. And it brought a lot of audience. So we were sold out, and we even did standing in the back. So I never took a seat in there. So
Mhm.
I don't know what the arc of that was in terms of the audience receptivity, but I do know that I was there every night in the lobby, and that there always there never was, nor did the actors ever report any kind of what the
Mayhem. People are
yeah,
walking
yeah.
out.
Are
We
you
can't.
kidding me?
I
And
just,
I don't think there was
yeah.
time for word to get out, because I think we did whatever, however many shows, 5, 6, bang, 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 back
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah,
back.
yeah, right. I just love the idea that the invitation is there and we're so ready as a loosely religion, I mean, that's what we miss about theater, right?
The
That
sacred,
larger sacred
yeah,
thing that happens, and then to put it out there and have
yeah,
it be collective and name it,
yeah.
without naming it. And
That's wonderful, and that takes us back to Stella and why she got down on her knees to scrub the floor. That was
yeah.
the lesson.
Well, I want to get a couple of these questions in, and I know we're getting a little bit late on time, but um, there's a question here about your relationship with, you did the introductions, right, for Pema Chödrön's books. Is that
Oh no, I did audio.
audio? That's what it was.
Yeah,
That's what it was. Yeah.
I
How did that connection?
oh
Um,
I well, Shambhala Publications, which was started ages ago, and now is they do a lot of Buddhist text and mindfulness,
mhm.
and they've published all of Pema's books. And I used to write early on in my writing career for a journal called East West Journal, which was one of the very first alternative lifestyle. This goes back to around the time I was, let's see, it was back in the, oh gosh, 70s, I guess. And so I knew the people from, I knew some people who had gone from East West Journal to Shambhala Publications. That was their career path. So when it came time that they were looking for a reader for Pema's books, because she wasn't going to do them anymore because it took too much out of her. She was
Mm.
getting older and she just could not, she did not want to do another audiobook. So anyway, because of my meditation practice and my experience with the material, and because I was a performer, it was illogical. So they asked me and I did a
That makes
little,
sense.
yeah. And that was great. That was wonderful.
There's a question here. Can you speak to your experience of bringing Komachi
Ah,
to the stage?
oh gosh. Yeah. Is that from
Is
Jen?
that, am I opening a very, is that a
Yeah,
10-minute
yeah, I
question?
think it is. I think we better come back
Well,
another
then you
time.
must come back another
Yeah,
time.
that I'll tell very briefly. Komachi is the name of a real woman poet from medieval Japan who was considered, you can read her work, it's positively gloriously lovely, stunning. And she was also considered a great beauty, and famous relationships with wonderful men. So there are 5 Japanese no plays that are written in the course of no theater about Komachi, and I did put those all together into one evening of theater some few years ago. And ever, if our theaters open up again, I would love to bring that out into the world. We did perform it. It's one of the last things I did at Villanova. It was a wonderful audience. In fact, the ambassador from Japan to the US was in the audience and really appreciated it. But it's, yeah, that's Komachi. So I encourage everyone to look at Komachi's poetry. It's quite great.
Well, Joanna Rotté, thank you so much. I have just pages of questions here and I could sit for a long time and ask you questions. So perhaps maybe we'll have you come back again and do round 2 of this conversation.
Well, we'll have dessert.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Dessert, coffee, you know, and just sit for a while. We'll just sit for as long as we need to.
That sounds lovely.
I so much appreciate you being here and sharing your work with us, and I look forward to talking to you more about all this. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure. Good night to all.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
And to everyone who has joined us here this evening, thank you so much. We're just a little over, but the questions could go on. And I hope that you'll join us next week at 5 p.m. when Todd Hilsey is with us. He is a producer and an actor and worked with a lot of interesting people on projects as a producer, and so much happening. We'll send more information out to you with our weekly email that comes out on Wednesday. If you're part of the IRC's mailing list, you'll get that email. If not, just head on over to the Facebook page and you can discover who's coming up in any given week. But it's going to be a fun conversation. Todd's got a lot of experience in producing and acting with the Hudson Theater Works theater right outside of New York City. So for everyone else, thank you so much for being here tonight, and zoom on over to the YouTube page and subscribe to past episodes. And we do hope to see you next week, next Saturday at 5 p.m. And until then, wishing you very safe and healthy journeys in this week ahead.